presence of a vast supply of oil here in Azerbaijan must seem like a great boon, a huge blessing. I mean, the economy is booming, much of it because of oil and natural gas. A lot of that oil, by the way, right offshore here in the Caspian Sea. Business is booming, new buildings are going up. In Baku, for many, many decades, has had beautiful boulevards and streets and whatnot, but now you've got these gleaming metal and glass buildings, skyscrapers. Some say it's the next Dubai. However, if you were to go back to 1920, you may find that the presence of oil here was seen more as a curse, as it drew the attention of the armies of the newly formed Soviet Union to the north, who eyed all that oil covetously. Thus, the very independence, the newly won independence of Azerbaijan, was under threat. Now, we tend to think of oil as sort of a modern commodity, but people have been using oil here for thousands of years. You could go back 2,500 years in this area, and you'd find the Medes digging oil wells and bringing oil up out of the ground using leather buckets. The ancient Greeks described how the people here dipped their weapons, dipped the ends of their arrows or their spears in oil, set them on fire, and then let them fly at their enemies. In ancient times, in medieval times, oil was used medicinally. Oil was used to light houses and, the clay or metal oil lamps. In fact, if you were to go back, for centuries, caravans, entire caravans, would transport the oil of this region elsewhere. Until the Arabs showed up, changed everything as they did in so many places. The inhabitants of this region were largely Zoroastrians. In other words, followers of Zarathustra or Zoroaster, so-called fire worshippers. And they used the oil and gas of the region as part of their worship. Anytime this area was under foreign domination, major foreign domination, big empire, whatnot, that empire tended to rake in Baku bucks, because of oil revenue from this region. And so the Safavids, for example, Safavids of Persia, very famous empire, famous dynasty, actually originally from this area, made tons of money off of oil from here. So as a result, this area is dotted with hundreds and hundreds of old school, or at least was dotted with hundreds and hundreds of old school oil wells. For the first modern oil well, you'd think maybe it was created in Pennsylvania in the United States. No, over a decade before the first modern oil well in Pennsylvania, the first modern oil well was dug here. In 1900, Baku was the Saudi Arabia of its time. See, for decades, foreign capital had been invested heavily in the local oil industry. We're talking names like the Rothschilds, the Nobel brothers, the Shell Transport and Trading Company, which would later become Royal Dutch Shell, and others, Armenian capital, Russian capital. Some of these big oil barons would build massive, beautiful mansions right here in Baku. See, in the late 19th century, the great oil company in the world was Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, based out of the United States. But by 1900, Baku was producing half the world's oil. Well, the world changed in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. Russia pulled out of the war, the Great War, and Lenin and his Bolshevik compatriots ultimately gained control of the country. And this would have great historical meaning for Baku. By January of 1920, Lenin had already given the order, the Red Army and several Caspian Sea units, given the order to invade Azerbaijan. Their goal was twofold. First, secure Baku and the oil fields, obviously. And second, secure the Transcaucasian Railway. See, Russia, for years, had been very, very dependent on Baku oil. In fact, in 1900, when Baku was providing half the world's oil supply, Baku provided 98% of the Russian Empire's oil supply. 98%. As for the railway, the Transcaucasian Railway had been begun in the 1860s at Poti, a Georgian town on the Black Sea coast. By the 1870s, it was passing through Tbilisi, and by the 1880s, it had connected here to Baku. That meant that not only could Russian imperial troop movements be made much more rapid and effective, going across the southern Caucasus, joining with Central Asia, connecting Central Asia to Russia proper, but also that all that Baku oil could be much more easily transported across the Caucasus to the Black Sea, where it could be shipped to Russian towns and cities. And the dependence on Baku oil grew. In 1900, the Transcaucasian Railway was connected directly to the Russian rail networks, further heightening that dependence. The taking of Azerbaijan was not about aiding local Bolsheviks in their struggle, as Lenin billed it. It was about Baku oil, plain and simple. Lenin had great plans, and later Stalin, of course, he'll carry them out. Lenin had great plans for the industrialization of the Soviet Union, and he needed Caucasus fuel to make those plans a reality. And that's really what it was all about. In the immediate takeover, hundreds of people died. And then a few months later, in a revolt against the Soviets, thousands, possibly tens of thousands, were raped, tortured, and killed. After the conquest of Baku had been made complete, Lenin didn't celebrate, some victory of the working class over the Azerbaijani bourgeoisie or something like that. No, what he celebrated, somewhat ironically given his supposed communist worldview, was that he and his compatriots now owned the basis for an industrial economy, an industrialized economy in the Soviet Union. That's what it was all about. Throughout the Soviet era, the vast bulk of this region's oil wealth was siphoned away by the regime. Of course, that's nothing new, some foreign empire siphoning off local wealth. But in this case, the Soviet Union is uniquely dependent on Baku oil. We have correspondence between local leaders and Lenin, where the locals are begging Lenin to let them keep, 4% of the revenue from oil to be spent in this area, as opposed to siphon away. But in any case, even though other sources of oil were discovered in the Soviet Union between 1920 and 1940, by the time World War II came rolling around, Baku still provided Russia with 75% of its oil needs. In fact, Lenin's decision to invade Azerbaijan may be one of the most momentous in the 20th century, of 20th century history. It certainly changed the world. Think about it. Without Soviet control of the Baku oil fields, does the Soviet Union survive? All those promises and plans of industrialization, they're nothing. They're fantasies without Azerbaijan fuel. How about World War II? Does Stalin beat Hitler without Baku oil? That's where the real war was, by the way. The Eastern Front was where World War II was really fought. In comparison, virtually everything else, almost everything else, was small potatoes, which is an amazing thing to say, I know, but it's true. The Eastern Front is where Hitler lost the bulk of his soldiers. He lost millions of soldiers along the Eastern Front. The Russians could have lost up to 27 million people on the Eastern Front. That's where the war was won. That's where the Germans were pushed back. And couldn't have been done without Baku oil. In fact, Baku oil doubly beat Hitler in that not only did it fuel the Soviet armies who eventually turned to the tide, but Baku oil is one of the things that drew Hitler into Russia in the first place. One of the primary reasons for invading Russia was to secure those oil fields. And one of the biggest tragedies of all is that during the heyday of its oil production, talking from the late 19th century to the mid-20th, the vast bulk of Azerbaijan's oil wealth was being siphoned off by foreign empires, siphoned away from a country that remained poor into the late 20th century. Now, things appear to be on the rise economically for Azerbaijan these days, but who knows? Who knows what it would be like had all that foreign investment and local investment from over a century ago been allowed to thrive and develop up to the present. We'll never know. Lenin strikes again.